more types of enforced deprivation. We're joined by Browne Hanley, a historian, Michael Dowling, an economist at DCU, and Niamh Harrigan, a sociologist at UCC. Browne, do you think that if Scottish people looked at our experience of independence, they'd be encouraged to vote yes to independence on Thursday?
I think they would be, because I think the circumstances are very, very different. Firstly, thankfully, the government in London has said they will recognise Scottish independence. Unfortunately, in 1918, the British government didn't recognise our independence, but I don't think there's any chance they're going to send in modern black and tans into Scotland. Secondly, despite the very emotional atmosphere in Scotland, there isn't going to be a civil war following independence. I think that's perfectly clear. I think that they can look at the Irish experience, and there are some similarities. I mean, I think it's not a threat of immediate and terrible war, but certainly the British establishment are bluffing and also threatening the Scottish people at the moment. But I do think they're in a much better position than we were in 1921, 1922. And I also think the enthusiasm that's carrying the campaign for independence could lead to a much fairer Scotland than what we had here.
But when you look at how we managed our own affairs, we managed them pretty badly. We had recessions, as I was saying there, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 70s, 80s, and 2008 to 2014. We have had very high unemployment during a lot of that time, very high immigration. A lot of people voted against the new state by leaving. So when you put that, and also we have a very unequal society. Now, why should Scotland think that they're going to do much better than we did?
I think firstly you have to look at the nature of the campaign for independence, and it'd be a mistake to see it purely about Alex Salmond and the SNP. On the ground, there's a huge movement in Scotland, particularly among the young, and it's very noticeable in working class areas as well, that they see independence as going to bring about a much fairer society, and that's going to be very hard to put back in the bottle. I think unfortunately in this country we had, certainly by the mid-1920s, a very conservative revolution. In Scotland, the debate is left of centre. People are rejecting the remnants of Thatcherism. There's one Tory MP in Scotland. They want to ensure that their children never live under another Tory government. But it's also the case that they're rejecting New Labour. I mean, it's desperation stakes to see Gordon Browne being sent to Glasgow to try and convince people of why they should stay in the Union, when his party, in fact, you know, by deserting its roots, have left this whole swathe of Scottish Labour voters now going for independence.
Niamh, looking back at Irish independence and the way we've managed to deal with our own affairs, do you think we've done well or badly?
I think we have a mixed report. I think in the first 20 years of the state's existence, I think a very strong desire to hold the state together, a strong desire to forge a kind of cohesive national identity. I think that took priority, even during the period of the economic war, really over a kind of a pragmatic approach which focused on economic growth. That ran aground in the 1950s, and we see a switch in the 1960s to a more outward-looking policy, but one that came at a massive price. Our very outwardness now has led to a new form of boom to bust. So I think it's a mixed report, but Vincent, I have to say that I think if one is to simply look at the question of independence for Ireland or Scotland at the level of money, and funny enough, even at the level of material inequality, it is to miss an element of why Irish people sought independence in the late 1920s, 20th and early 20th century, and also why Scottish people are seeking independence now. There is these issues of identity. There are these issues of self-realisation that don't go away and that are important. They may move beyond pounds, shilling and pence, but it's interesting. I have been surprised at the level of support for the Yes campaign, and to me there seems to be some energy around taking a risk around certainly some elements of their future economically in Scotland.
Gareth Fitzgerald, in an essay that I would look for before coming on the programme this evening, we couldn't find, but argued that he supported 1916, even though, even in spite of its undemocratic nature, on the grounds that had an impetus not been given at that time to Irish independence, he doubted that we would ever have bothered with independence, because the beginnings of the welfare state started in Britain in the early 1920s, and that people might have thought we're better off hanging in
Well,
there.
this is revisiting, I mean, the tiff that kind of emerged between Gerry Adams and John Bruton over the summer, which was about this question of, the granting of Home Rule in 1914 and if that would have come into play in 1918. But in fairness, to revert to Brian's point, I mean, when 1918 rolled around, there was considerable British resistance to following through there. And in fairness, Vincent, I think if you look at the experience of subsequent colonies breaking away from Britain, I mean, the fact that Ireland did it, okay, I don't know if we could say we did it completely successfully because we had a lot of economic issues afterwards, but nevertheless, the fact it was done and it was done in that kind of robust way, I think did set a pattern.
Yeah. We made quite a mess of our own affairs.
We're a role model for a lot of small EU countries. A lot of the EU accession countries have cited success as something that they want to emulate. Scotland would be a similar small country, bigger than Ireland, but another small country.
They thought they thought of emulating us until 2008. There's not that much enthusiasm in Europe to emulate us, given what has happened since 2008.
Well, it did die away for a few years, all right. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've seen over the last 2 years, like the rapid fall in unemployment that you see from a flexible small country, the very quick climb back from the abyss, that because we could quickly make changes, that the UK is still struggling to make those types of changes.
The unemployment figures can be misleading. I'm not saying they necessarily, but it can be misleading because of emigration. As more people emigrate, the lower the unemployment is going to be. And what's more telling is the issue of jobs. And there's a big question over the reliability of the figures on job creation.
I mean, there was net migration into the country in the last household survey, if I remember correctly. So we seem to be turning that. I mean, I think it's broadly accepted that we're turning that corner. But
which corner?
That we're getting back into more optimistic economic times, but we seem to have been able to make these kind of rapid changes, taking the expenses out of the economy a lot quicker than big economies are able to.
But look at the way we did it. Look at the devastation caused to lives of already vulnerable people. Like, is that
but Scotland has a choice to go another road, and I think if they have any sense, they will. I mean, I think Scotland would be wrong to try and adopt the Irish economic model. I mean, but I think what you have on the ground in Scotland is this enthusiasm and this impetus to do something different. I mean, what they are rejecting is the policies that brought about recession in Britain and Ireland. Certainly many of the people who are campaigning for a yes on the ground are doing that. And there's another key reason. I mean, one of the key reasons why we had such a conservative state in the years after independence or semi-independence was partition. You had economic base in the north cut off and you had a Protestant-dominated state. Here you had the Catholic Church in a hugely powerful position, abetted by the state. That is not going to happen in Scotland. 43% of people in Scotland in the last census put down no religion. You know, it is a much more secular society than we were in the 1920s, and you are not going to have that conservative society come out of independence. There is an important
issue, I think, in fairness. If we look at 2008 and we look at that moment between 2008 2010, there were two things going on. I mean, we had this internal Ponzi scheme with the property bubble and the banks, and we were all familiar with that. But there also was an external kind of economic environment which contributed to that bust at the time. Now, I suppose the interesting thing for Scotland at the moment, and I think it's striking the way in which big business are lining up, particularly in the last final furlong with the scare tactics. But you know, the Scottish independence, unfortunately, if we look at the broader context of the EU, will not, and it remains to be seen how it will affect it, but it won't remove those external forces. Do you know, in fairness, Brian, if we look at, say, Ireland in 1921 and 1922 and the kind of, okay, we were locked into the British economy in many ways, but the kind of freedoms that was there in terms of making decisions, if we look at if Scotland were accepted into the EU, and there is a question mark given the situation in Spain.
There's no question mark.
Well,
they'll be in the EU in 2 years.
I think they will, Vincent, but I think the timeline is important, and they could make them suffer by delaying the timeline, and then the question becomes, like, if you look at Salmon and what he's saying as many of the virtues of independence, it's unclear to me, given the extent of EU control over economic policy now in all states, whether that actually will follow through.
Well, I was just about to make that point. Like, what does independence mean nowadays? Like, look, how independent is Ireland now? We're controlled. The Troika is gone, but we're still controlled by Brussels to a very large extent. By the European Commission, we've got to get our budgets approved by the European Commission. They tremendous pressure to introduce what they call labour market reforms, which means make jobs more insecure and more low paid than was the case previously. And you know, that's create a crueler and more harsh society, and we're almost forced into that now. I emphasise almost.
Well, like some of the most positive labour market reforms protecting workers have come from the EU. In terms of things like contracts of indefinite leave, of indefinite duration, that
was in the early stages of the EU. But the nature of the EU has changed quite a bit, and now it is what's called, in the fortunate phrase, neoliberal agenda stuff, where privatise as much as possible, incentivise rich people to create more jobs as much as possible, to help with inequality and to help with reasonable working conditions and reasonable pay.
And get a London Lord in to run the financial system, as they did recently in the EU Commission. Now, there was one thing actually about, like if we're looking at Ireland 1916, Ireland 2007, and what Scotland is planning to do, the big kind of mistake that Scotland is making is this plan to tie themselves to a bigger currency. This idea that they'll have some form of sterling, as we did in 1922. After for about 6 years, we just used sterling for 6 years. For another 45 years, we were intimately tied to sterling. That's what Scotland wants to do. And in the most recent financial crisis, our flexibility was heavily cut back by the fact that we couldn't react. And yet Scotland wants to go down.
It's striking, though, the way in which some senior figures in the EU have come out and been really critical and engaged in these like Barroso, scaremongering around Scottish independence. But if you look at EU policy right up to the mid-1990s, with the Committee of the Regions, with the Bureau for Less, the European Union in the 80s and 90s actually did a lot to create the scenarios that we're seeing today in Scotland and Catalonia. They encouraged and supported minor nationalisms, minority nationalisms, to grow like this. This was deliberate EU policy, and part of it was the idea that you erode the nation state, you build up at the supranational level, and you build up these regional identities. Now, obviously, there have been movements away from that now, but the EU themselves contributed to some of what we're seeing today.
Yeah. When you look at Irish foreign policy, you might think that really we're a pretty abject place as an independent state. We follow, like, whatever America says is okay for us, and we will never criticise America, certainly hardly at all, ever criticise America, no matter what horrors they perpetrate around the world, because of foreign direct investment. It's abject.
I agree with you, but none of that negates the case for Scottish independence. And Scotland will get rid of Trident. They will make, one of the reasons, again, for this idea of independence is that most Scottish people opposed the Iraq War, and they had no way of changing that. The fact is, there is one Tory MP in Scotland and there's a Tory government in London. Independence at least sets about giving people a choice in that. And there is a thing called self-determination, which, even with all the caveats of there's problems in globalisation, and that's true, the fact is, if a majority of Scottish people desire to govern their own state, they have that right, and I hope they do make that decision.
Well, do they have that freedom, though? And that's my point, that Scotland is going to be a competitor for foreign direct investment, and it's likely to go the Irish route, which is capitulate entirely to American foreign policy demands, so as to ensure that we get as much American foreign direct investment in as possible.
Well, it's certainly likely they're going to cut their corporation tax rate very quickly if they do achieve independence, and they will put themselves in a kind of a quasi-dependent relationship in the way we do. But I suppose, Vincent, the bigger issue is whether the consensus, which is almost like the Washington consensus in the 90s, this hardline neoliberal consensus
Most people haven't a clue what the Washington consensus is, and they're right not to have a clue.
Yes, well, it's a hardline neoliberal consensus that the interests of the markets should be favoured, and I think we all know what that means, Vincent. Anybody who's been around during the bank guarantee and the bailout will have some concept of that means. And that is currently the EU economic orthodoxy, and the question remains as to whether that will continue or whether that will be unpicked. At the moment, it works very much in the favour of one major EU nation state, and to a much lesser extent in the favour of other EU nation states. Now, if those other EU nation states start to get together and start to unpick that policy, then we may see a change which will not only affect us, but will also affect an independent or indeed a Scotland that's part of a united
Look
kingdom.
at what we did when we got independence. We accepted, hardly anything changed. The idea that this was freeing the people of Ireland was completely illusory. They weren't freed from economic hardship. They weren't freed from subordination in terms of powerful economic interests controlling their lives. It made no difference. It was an illusion.
It made quite a few differences. First of all, because the British Army left most of the 26 counties. Now, again, that may seem, not so important now. In 1922, people couldn't believe that the Union Jack was coming down on all these barracks, which for centuries, every decent-sized town in Ireland had a British Army barracks. Secondly, there were gains made under independence that simply would have been eked out over decades under British rule or would never have come at all. There were, firstly in the 1930s, when Fianna Fáil still had to attach a radical base to itself, there were benefits made in housing, there were benefits in social welfare, there were changes in work.
We might have much Britain because the welfare system had begun to emerge.
But again, there's no guarantee. Britain resisted even the tiniest reforms, and even the Home Rule Bill that people talk about was almost nothing by the British were ready to give it. So there had to be some form of independence struggle, and I'm all for counterfactual history. But the reality is, when we look at 1919 to 1921, majority of people voted for independence. That was absolutely denied.
But people thought there was going to be freedom. And for most people, there was no freedom. There was the same subordination to powerful interests as there was, except to, at least in symbolic terms, it was Irish powerful interests that were dominating them rather than British foreign interests, British powerful interests.
Well, I think you have to question, first of all, the extent to which Irish people actually expected freedom. If you look at 1916 and the actual facts of 1916, that was a relatively small group of people who engaged in a particular activity which was not widely supported in many cases across the state. Now, if you look at the period after that, and particularly when the Black and Tans came in, you see a gradual disaffection with the state and this kind of ignoring of the British state and a growing hostility while the new state builds itself up. And I suppose, Vincent, if you look at the content, what it was a replacing of some of those British powerful interests with more Irish powerful interests, in many cases the Catholic Church.
That's my point, that for the most people, freedom meant nothing.
But again, is there any other road that could have been taken? Of course, I would argue there was. There was a more radical road. It wasn't taken. But none of this negates, first of all, the right of the majority of Irish people to have independence from Britain, which even at the best of times, even when people put up with British rule, the majority of people regarded it as alien. Most Irish nationalists did not accept that the British ruled Ireland by consent. Ultimately, they ruled by force.
Most Irish nationalists up to 1918 would have been very satisfied with Home Rule, which would have been a very faint form.
In December 1918, most Irish nationalists voted, in theory at least, for a completely independent republic.
All right.
The idea of Home Rule was in decline, and it's even in decline before the 1916 Rising. But I think you can put forward, quite rightly, a critique of what develops in this country, and I agree with most of your critique. But that does not negate, firstly, the desire for independence, either in Ireland or in Scotland, or roads less travelled. Now, I think the very fact that the British establishment are absolutely losing their minds over the prospect of a yes vote shows you that actually it does mean something. It will be a blow to the City of London. It will be a blow to David Cameron. It will potentially point to another road for people in Europe. And I think the enthusiasm that there is in Scotland, and again, from what I'm hearing there, the key will be the young vote and the working class vote. What was the Labour vote?
And
if
surely,
they vote
Vincent,
yes,
the essence of freedom is to choose who governs you. And
no. No, the essence of freedom is to be able to govern yourself, to have autonomy, to be able to flourish yourself.
In the absence of a direct democracy situation where everybody is governing themselves, in a parliamentary democracy, then the essence of freedom is to be able to vote for those that govern you.
What does freedom mean if, for instance, you're employed by somebody who makes your life a total misery and pays you a pittance? What does freedom mean in that situation?
It doesn't mean much, but there has always been, despite the lack of economic freedom in many Western democracies, a struggle for political freedom.
I know,
and I believe
but
that's important.
It's illusory. It's fake. Is my point.
But if you look at the flip side, if we look at somewhat, say, a place like China, where and some of the socialist states where there was much more intense efforts to achieve economic freedom, but there were losses of political freedom as part of that, Vincent.
Michael, were we better off in going for independence than we would have been had we hung in there?
I mean, there's only so far you can take 1916. I mean, look at a recent new country, Slovakia. Split off from Czechoslovakia, broke off, had an income a quarter of its neighbours. Like per capita, it was destitute compared to its neighbours, the Czech Republic next to it. It's now up competing with the Czech Republic for the same level of wealth. I'd imagine if there was to be a kind of a serious comparison drawn, and there hasn't been, but if there was to be, it'd be somewhere like Slovakia you're looking at.
I'm just asking
Ireland
you,
in 1916.
Ireland, was it a good idea for Ireland to become independent? Since for most people there was no freedom, and they lived in the same subordinated position as they had done previously. And had we hung in there, we would have had the beginnings of the welfare state, and then the full flourishing welfare state from 1947-48 onwards.
We've a lot more freedom. I mean, we send a lot more people to university. We give a lot more people kind of real life opportunities compared to the UK.
That would have happened had we stayed in.
No, but all the social ills you're talking about
in the UK,
all the social ills you're talking about, mass immigration, exploitation of workers, all those things were occurring under British rule.
Yeah.
So it isn't the case that had we remained under British rule, they necessarily would have been ameliorated.
But
we wouldn't necessarily have got a welfare state, because under, for example, if we had been granted a limited form of home rule, it would have been dominated by conservative nationalists who possibly would have found some way of blocking the extension of the welfare state, like, for example, some of the unionists tried to do in the north. So I think there's no direct line between.
The northern example is interesting in this context, in that they did much better by remaining part. For the majority of people in the north, the poorer people in the north, they did better by remaining part of the UK than...
I think to argue that unemployed Catholics in the Bogside and Derry in the 1960s might have been a bit of a stretch, even though they had the National Health Service, and I know that quite well. Yeah. But I think the fact was that
they remained in a state which was sectarian and which viewed them as lesser. And there is, when we look at the desire for Scottish independence, there is, and you can see it very much in, for instance, the examples paid at the moment of wealthy people in Edinburgh, being very supportive. There is this idea that the Scots, particularly the more working class, feel lesser within the British state as it is, and there is a genuine desire at an identity level for something different.
All right, but I'm suggesting that this identity fetish.
It's not a fetish.
British nationalism is a far more pernicious form of nationalism than Scottish or Irish, I would argue. And it's not a fetish for the Scottish to want self-determination. They have a chance to avoid the mistakes we made.
Tell that to the Queen.
I mean, if Scotland was independent, would we be arguing that it should merge with the rest of the UK? I mean, we wouldn't. Like, if we flipped it around like that, like it's a status quo argument. Gone. Why do you want to change something that's kind of working? It's if it was an independent country, no one would be making the argument that you need to merge with your bigger neighbour. So I think it's an argument based on fear.
Finally,
it's an argument that you're tired.
On Thursday.
Hopefully, yes.
No, I know, but
a narrow yes.
You mind to hope.
A narrow yes.
What?
A narrow yes.
What do you think?
Almost certainly no.
I have to say, I know. Yeah, I think it'll be
unfortunately.
No. But my heart says yes, Vincent.
I think it will be yes. I used to think that if only the Scottish nationalists had Brendan Howlin and Alan Shatter on the other side, they'd turn around the no vote and they'd win it comfortably. But then I looked at it, but they've got David Cameron and Miliband. So they're wonderful campaigners for a yes vote. Cameron complained saying he'd be heartbroken if there's a yes vote. I mean, what more incentive do you need to vote yes? Anyway, thank you, Browne, Michael and Niamh, for being with us. We now go to a preview of tomorrow morning's newspapers, and we're joined again